Chapter 26. The Utilitarians. Throughout the period from Kant to Nietzsche, professional philosophers in Great Britain remained almost completely unaffected by their German contemporaries, with the sole exception of Sir William Hamilton, who had little influence. Coleridge and Carlyle, it is true, were profoundly affected by Kant, Fichte, and the German Romantics, but they were not philosophers in the technical sense. Somebody seems to have once mentioned Kant to James Mill, who, after a cursory inspection, remarked, "I see well enough what poor Kant would be at." But this degree of recognition is exceptional. In general, there is a complete silence about the Germans. Bentham and his school derived their philosophy, in all its main outlines, from Locke, Hartley, and Helvetius. Their importance is not so much philosophical as political, as the leaders of British radicalism, and as the men who unintentionally prepared the way for the doctrines of socialism. Jeremy Bentham, who was the recognized head of the philosophical radicals, was not the sort of man one expects to find at the head of a movement of this sort. He was born in 1748, but did not become a radical till 1808. He was painfully shy, and could not without great trepidation endure the company of strangers. He wrote voluminously, but never bothered to publish. What was published under his name had been benevolently purloined by his friends. His main interest was jurisprudence, in which he recognized Helvetius and Beccaria as his most important predecessors. It was through the theory of law that he became interested in ethics and politics. He bases his whole philosophy on two principles, the association principle and the greatest happiness principle. The association principle had been emphasized by Hartley in 1749. Before him, though association of ideas was recognized as occurring, it was regarded, for instance, by Locke only as a source of trivial errors. Bentham, following Hartley, made it the basic principle of psychology. He recognizes association of ideas and language, and also association of ideas and ideas. By means of this principle, he aims at a deterministic account of mental occurrences. In essence, the doctrine is the same as the more modern theory of the conditioned reflex, based on Pavlov's experiments. The only important difference is that Pavlov's conditioned reflex is physiological, whereas the association of ideas was purely mental. Pavlov's work is therefore capable of a materialistic explanation, such as is given to it by the behaviorists, whereas the association of ideas led rather towards a psychology more or less independent of physiology. There can be no doubt that, scientifically, the principle of the conditioned reflex is an advance on the older principle. Pavlov's principle is this. Given a reflex according to which a stimulus B produces a reaction C, and given that a certain animal has frequently experienced a stimulus A at the same time as B, it often happens that in time the stimulus A will produce the reaction C even when B is absent. To determine the circumstances under which this happens is a matter of experiment. Clearly, if we substitute ideas for A, B, and C, Pavlov's principle becomes that of the association of ideas. Both principles, indubitably, are valid over a certain field. The only controversial question is as to the extent of this field. Bentham and his followers exaggerated the extent of the field in the case of Hartley's principle, as certain behaviorists have in the case of Pavlov's principle. To Bentham, determinism in psychology was important, because he wished to establish a code of laws, and, more generally, a social system which would automatically make men virtuous. His second principle, that of the greatest happiness, became necessary at this point in order to define virtue. Bentham maintained that what is good is pleasure or happiness. He used these words as synonyms, and what is bad is pain. Therefore, one state of affairs is better than another if it involves a greater balance of pleasure over pain, or a smaller balance of pain over pleasure. Of all possible states of affairs, that one is best which involves the greatest balance of pleasure over pain. There is nothing new in this doctrine, which came to be called Utilitarianism. It had been advocated by Hutcheson as early as 1725. Bentham attributes it to Priestley, who, however, had no special claim to it. It is virtually contained in Locke. Bentham's merit consists not in the doctrine, but in his vigorous application of it to various practical problems. Bentham held not only that the good is happiness in general, but also that each individual always pursues what he believes to be his own happiness. The business of the legislator, therefore, is to produce harmony between public and private interests. It is to the interest of the public that I should abstain from theft, but it is only to my interest where there is an effective criminal law. Thus, the criminal law is a method of making the interests of the individual coincide with those of the community. That is its justification. Men are to be punished by the criminal law in order to prevent crime, not because we hate the criminal. It is more important that the punishment should be certain than that it should be severe. In his day in England, many quite minor offences were subject to the death penalty, with the result that juries often refused to convict because they thought the penalty excessive. Bentham advocated abolition of the death penalty for all but the worst offences, and before he died, the criminal law had been mitigated in this respect. Civil law, he says, should have 4 aims: subsistence, abundance, security, and equality. It will be observed that he does not mention liberty. In fact, he cared little for liberty. He admired the benevolent autocrats who preceded the French Revolution, Catherine the Great and the Emperor Francis. He had a great contempt for the doctrine of the rights of man. The rights of man, he said, are plain nonsense. The imprescriptible rights of man, nonsense on stilts. When the French revolutionaries made their Déclaration des droits de l'homme, Bentham called it a metaphysical work, the ne plus ultra of metaphysics. Its articles, he said, could be divided into 3 classes. 1, those that are unintelligible. 2, those that are false. 3, those that are both. Bentham's ideal, like that of Epicurus, was security, not liberty. Wars and storms are best to read of, but peace and calms are better to endure. His gradual evolution towards radicalism had 2 sources. On the one hand, a belief in equality, deduced from the calculus of pleasures and pains. On the other hand, an inflexible determination to submit everything to the arbitrament of reason as he understood it. His love of equality early led him to advocate equal division of a man's property among his children, and to oppose testamentary freedom. In later years, it led him to oppose monarchy and hereditary aristocracy, and to advocate complete democracy, including votes for women. His refusal to believe without rational grounds led him to reject religion, including belief in God. It made him keenly critical of absurdities and anomalies in the law, however venerable their historical origin. He would not excuse anything on the ground that it was traditional. From early youth he was opposed to imperialism, whether that of the British in America or that of other nations. He considered colonies a folly. It was through the influence of James Mill that Bentham was induced to take sides in practical politics. James Mill was 25 years younger than Bentham, and an ardent disciple of his doctrines, but he was also an active radical. Bentham gave Mill a house, which had belonged to Milton, and assisted him financially while he wrote a history of India. When this history was finished, the East India Company gave James Mill a post, as they did afterwards to his son, until their abolition as a sequel to the Mutiny. James Mill greatly admired Condorcet and Helvetius. Like all radicals of that period, he believed in the omnipotence of education. He practiced his theories on his son, John Stuart Mill, with results partly good, partly bad. The most important bad result was that John Stuart could never quite shake off his influence, even when he perceived that his father's outlook had been narrow. James Mill, like Bentham, considered pleasure the only good and pain the only evil. But like Epicurus, he valued moderate pleasure most. He thought intellectual enjoyments the best and temperance the chief virtue. The intense was with him a byword of scornful disapprobation, says his son, who adds that he objected to the modern stress laid upon feeling. Like the whole Utilitarian school, he was utterly opposed to every form of romanticism. He thought politics could be governed by reason, and expected men's opinions to be determined by the weight of evidence. If opposing sides in a controversy are presented with equal skill, there is a moral certainty, so he held, that the greater number will judge right. His outlook was limited by the poverty of his emotional nature, but within his limitations he had the merits of industry, disinterestedness, and rationality.